watching Channel Africa Conversations.
So this is absolutely massive, and also a fantastic opportunity for Africa to really state their case. I guess South Africa is the host here, but I think it's safe to say that South Africa, is actually speaking on behalf of Africa as a whole, that much as it is a part of the G20 and other African countries are not, but the fact that it is actually hosting this on an African soil, it is absolutely momentous an occasion for Africa to state its case.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. Today our attention is focused on Cape Town, where finance ministers and central bank governors from the world's largest economies have gathered for the G20 finance track. Now, this meeting comes at a critical time as global economic challenges ranging from inflation and debt distress to climate and financing development funding dominate the agenda. To help us unpack the significance of this gathering and its implication for Africa, Channel Africa business reporter Innocent Somoza is there, and I spoke to him.
We are following the deputy finance ministers and ministers of finance and also deputy governors and central bank governors meeting here. The leaders, the G20 leaders, are gathering here in Cape Town to basically find ways to deal with the issues that are confronting the G20 nations, but also the continent with regards to the issues that has to do with debt sustainability. In fact, the president yesterday, when he was addressing the delegates, this is the president of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, he said that debt sustainability for developing economies will be key priority for South Africa during the ongoing G20 finance track. But also, colleague, you would know that the meetings form part of a series of ministerial and working groups, discussions, of course, scheduled throughout the year. This is, of course, ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit, which is expected to, of course, take place in November this year, where leaders of the G20, presidents of different nations in the G20 and also invited guests will be gathering in Johannesburg in November for that particular summit. But also, colleague, this gathering also follows a conclusion of the finance and central bank deputies meeting held on Tuesday. You would know that this also follows the G20 affairs ministers meeting in Johannesburg, foreign affairs ministers in Johannesburg. They were there to basically shape up perspectives and share perspectives on geopolitical environment, and also to line up priorities and tasks of the G20 Sherpa track for 2025. Now, it is in its 26th year. The president hailed the G20 in handling the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, he said that during COVID-19, he had the opportunity to meet with different leaders around the world amongst the G20 nations to basically outlined and find a common ground with regards to what the world was going through then during the issues of COVID-19. Now the shift, the focus, of course, now has shifted to the finance track here in Cape Town. It is, of course, expected to end today. In fact, there is going to be a media briefing later today. The discourse here so far is centered around climate financing, access to affordable financing, balancing growth and sustainability, targeting the tax gap across different G20 nations, also cross-border payment, to name a few. So these are some of the issues that are currently being ventilated here. But Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, this is the South Africa's Finance Minister, held a meeting yesterday. Of course, it was attended by the likes of the IMF, the World Bank, and also the United Nations to really find a solution with regards to the tax gap in the continent. I mean, you would know, colleague, that South Africa had to postpone its budget speech because of the disagreement of the budget. There's supposed to be a 2% increase to tax, but there was disagreement in Parliament. So therefore, they had to basically postpone it to another day. But that goes to show that the issues of tax really does call for attention, so hence I guess they had to basically, these leaders here, they had to sit down and look at the issues that has to do with the tax gap in the continent. Colleague?
We continue now with our focus on the G20, especially with the significant milestone, South Africa's presidency of the G20 2025. This marks the first time an African nation leads the group, presenting a unique opportunity to foreground the continent's priorities on the global stage. Joining us to explore the implications of this historic presidency is Associate Professor Ellias Phaahla, who's an expert in international relations. And he's helping us to unpack and discuss what this G20 might mean for Africa, particularly this year. Professor Phaahla, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you so much, Peter, and also thank you so much for having me on your show, and good morning to your viewers.
Prof, it's a significant milestone for sure, an African nation leading the G20. How significant is it, and what might that mean for our continent?
Well, first, let's, I think, understand what G20 really means. G20 is a group of 20 most prosperous economies in the world, and they club around together every year to discuss important and pressing issues around economic growth, economic sustainability, and of course, financial sustainability as well. This year, they're actually descending on South Africa. The first time an African country is able to host such a momentous occasion, as you correctly stated, it is the first time an African country can actually do that. So it is obviously massive that you can actually have 20 most prosperous economies, most powerful economies descending on one nation to actually discuss important issues that actually pertain to global growth, economic sustainability, and other important aspects as well. So this is absolutely massive, and also a fantastic opportunity for Africa to really state their case. I guess South Africa is the host here, but I think it's safe to say that South Africa is actually speaking on behalf of Africa as a whole, that much as it is a part of the G20 and other African countries are not, but the fact that it is actually hosting this on an African soil, it is absolutely momentous an occasion for Africa to state its case, particularly around pressing issues such as climate change as well.
So the themes that South Africa has chosen, solidarity, equality, and sustainability. I wonder how these themes play out, especially when we consider the challenges that our continent is facing.
Well, they are obviously very important. I think South Africa, understands very well that, these are the issues that we as a continent, not least South Africa itself, is actually dealing with, or is rather is grappling with equality, but also sustainability, solidarity. I think we have to really do a bit of an unpacking as to what all these words really mean, what they mean individually. Equality obviously speaks to economic difficulties that the continent is currently grappling with, not least South Africa with its triple challenges, which are obviously perennial, but also sustainability, which obviously speaks to green energy transition, climate change, and all the issues here that obviously speak to South Africa's own transition into a green energy-based kind of growth, which obviously has its own implications, and whether or not Africa should actually commit, and to what extent Africa should actually commit to sustainability and green energy relative to what the rest of the world is actually willing to commit. We all know very well right now that the United States is not quite keen on all these three thematic areas that South Africa has picked up as important talking points during the G20, and hence we can see that America has pulled out of the G20. It has not sent its Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marco Rubio, obviously very much a snap on South Africa's, hosting the event, but also a snap of, the very thematic areas that South Africa is trying to pursue as talking points during this occasion. So it is actually playing out quite interestingly. For Africa, it's absolutely vital that these issues are actually flagged and actually given global preeminence. But I guess other countries in the world are not quite in agreement, such as the United States. And I think America is very important to talk about here, because America is the biggest economy in the world, and not having it on the discussion tables, discussing these important issues, is obviously going to have far-reaching implications.
So as we record this conversation, the finance track of the G20 is taking place in Cape Town with the finance ministers. But you spoke about the foreign affairs ministers gathering, and I just wonder what you saw as the key takeaways, apart from the fact that America's really set the tone about how they're going to be treating the G20 going forward. What else could we pick up from what happened at the foreign affairs meetings?
Well, I think what we have actually picked up very interestingly as I think the juiciest part of the whole occasion, despite the fact that obviously they did actually rally behind South Africa, around its, thematic areas, which it has actually chosen as important talking points: solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and having, the rest of the G20 saying, we are actually behind you, South Africa, when it comes to all these important issues. And of course, America saying, well, we're not coming because of these issues are not really in the best interest of America's national interest, and therefore they will not be coming down to South Africa to actually have talk them through. But we actually saw the very interesting bit coming out of this G20, which is obviously the elephant in the room, and that is Russia, and of course, the Ukraine war that is currently being fought between Russia and Ukraine. And we've seen how the foreign ministers missed out on a photo opportunity, a family photo opportunity, to actually take a group picture together, because of the minister of finance from Russia being present, and that unfortunately had to be cancelled because they're not quite in agreement, having the minister of finance from Russia coming into the picture family, where they would actually be taken together and captured together as foreign affairs ministers in attendance of this occasion. So that is the juiciest part. But I think on a substantive level, we see how everybody seems to be drumming up support for South Africa, rallying behind South Africa in this particular case, and understanding the urgency of the issues that are currently being flagged out as important to actually be spoken about.
You mentioned Ukraine, and that has split the world. But another trouble spot has been Israel and Gaza. That has seen South Africa take a leading role in taking Israel, which is an ally to many of the G20 countries. Where does that put South Africa and the conversations that can happen within the G20 when we are sometimes on complete opposite sides to some of the thinking in the grouping?
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa, at the opening of the G20, he actually emphasized the importance of unity, cooperation, but also he emphasized the importance of acquiescing and coalescing around the international rule-based order we've all acquiesced around since the end of the Second World War, the UN Charter, the cooperation that is needed between countries to try as much as possible to actually avoid conflict and further divisions in the international system. And I think he said this all too deliberately, precisely because the world has been turned topsy-turvy since Donald Trump took over the reins of power in the White House, and nobody sort of knows exactly what the international rule-based order that we have all acquiesced around is going to look like in the foreseeable future. Nobody can actually say that. Everything seems to be hanging in a balance. But I think Cyril Ramaphosa, it was actually quite deliberate in the opening of the G20 that it is very vital that multilateralism is upheld, that cooperation is upheld, and that the support for the UN Charter is upheld. And I think it was actually a very subtle reference to South Africa's involvement in the current current dispute between the Palestinians and of course the Israelis in the Gaza, that South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ, it is very much South Africa's way of saying we actually support the multilateral rule-based order. We support the UN Charter, and we want to see the UN Charter living up to its full purpose. And taking the Israel to the ICJ, it is not really an attack on Israel. It is our way as a country to try and actually uphold all these important values that have actually kept us together since the end of the Second World War. So it does put South Africa in a very precarious situation, precisely because that's South Africa actually go on to pursue this issue, which is a human rights, humanitarian kind of an approach to dealing with international affairs, particularly those issues that are pressing, that obviously has far-reaching implications on global stability, such as the current war that is fought in the Gaza currently. Now, South Africa did that. To sort of send out a very clear message that it is important that we uphold the UN Charter and the multilateral rule-based order that we have acquiesced around since the end of the Second World War. Precarious situation, but I think the world, in a way, it is drumming up support for South Africa as well. Of course, they may not have actually explicitly said so themselves, but there is definitely that tacit indication that they are very much in support of what South Africa has actually done. At least in regards to the ICJ, and of course any other issue that is related to human rights, insofar as the international multilateral rule-based order is concerned.
So big stories for sure as we look to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But there are things happening on the continent, humanitarian situations developing in Sudan, the DRC, to mention just a couple. Does the G20 have space for important conversations for our issues as a continent?
Well, it is absolutely vital that the G20 finds space to try and address these issues, not least because this conference, this momentous occasion, is actually taking place on an African soil. Now, you cannot, fold your arms and pretend that you're not seeing any of these things that are currently happening on the continent. The conflict that is being fought currently, in the Eastern DRC, but also the situation that is also perennial in nature that is currently unfolding in Sudan. There is definitely, an opportunity here for the G20 to actually talk about this and actually, peter them out wherever possible. And South Africa itself playing that role as a continental, player, and of course a country that is obviously has got its sights set on the continent from all things economic growth, peace and development, and of course, peacekeeping as well. All these things that are very important that for South Africa to actually flag out. And I think at the end of the day, it really depends on whether or not South Africa is actually willing to actually put these issues on the table and actually, in a way, indirectly insist that, they're actually spoken about, because we are actually in Africa. And then another opportunity to host the G20, nobody knows when it's going to come, because, it's almost like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Now that we are here, let's talk about all of these important things. So there's definitely room.
Something else that's been burning for us as a continent is debt. And I wonder, again, with these key players that can influence and really help us in terms of solving our debt crisis, are sitting at this table. Is this an agenda that South Africa as president can push and get something out of it?
Well, so the debt issue is a very interesting thing that is currently in contention. So we know that the United States is not quite keen on debt cancellation, and there've been a couple of other European countries that have not really explicitly spoken in favor of debt cancellation, but they have sort of indicated quite tacitly that debt cancellation is not something that they deem to be of policy importance at the moment. Even though of course we know that debt cancellation cancellation is something that, as a continent, it is absolutely vital that it is actually addressed, and is addressed soon enough, given that it is a protracted issue that has actually been lingering far too long. And it seems to me that the longer it lingers, is the more the continent's economic agenda is actually stifled to an extent. So it's absolutely vital that debt cancellation is definitely spoken about. As for South Africa itself, that is actually quite interesting. Debt cancellation seems to be spoken of only fleetingly in passing, but in the policy utterances, particularly in the thematic areas that you've seen, especially around equality, which is actually part of the tripartite thematic ideals that South Africa is trying to push during this G20 conference. It doesn't seem to be speaking quite heavily on debt cancellation, particularly under the banner of equality, because I think it's absolutely vital that under equality, the issue of debt is obviously addressed, but it seems that South Africa has not really quite hammered home the message there as to highlight the importance of debt cancellation, something that perhaps might actually give the European participants in this G20 not all too important a reason for them to want to actually participate in the discussions around debt cancellation, especially if the host is not really putting the agenda on the table. I think at the end of the day, it is what kind of message is actually coming out of Pretoria, at least in terms of the thematic areas or the thematic document that they've actually put on the table, as to whether or not debt itself is something that it actually considers to be of vital importance. It is considered to be of importance, but as for it being of vital importance, I'm not quite sure. But I think that obviously, I think the board is in South Africa's court to actually make it known how important it is, and I think they need to do that fast during this during its presidency as a G20 host.
Our wish list is quite long with things that are of concern to us: climate finance and just energy transition. A lot of these G20 countries have made promises in terms of funding this just transition, and they haven't lived up to their promises. How does South Africa navigate this sensitive issue at a gathering like this?
I don't think South Africa has got the economic muscle to try and actually have it resolved at a continent, at a continent-wide kind of spectrum. I think what we actually have here, it seems like the only opportunity that is available is to actually talk about it and actually see what kind of commitments can actually be made, even though of course we cannot really trust those pledges, given the fact that most of these Western economies, they've not quite lived up to their own promises. But I think what is also very important to take into account here is that America, the United States, is now out of the Paris Agreement, and that actually makes it even more difficult, to have these discussions actually spoken about. And I guess maybe America, the reason why it did not want to participate in this conference, and other reasons that I've already indicated, is the very issue of sustainability, which sits at the very heart of South Africa's, thematic document, which is very obviously directly related to green energy, just transition. I mean, one can actually imagine what America is actually going to say, or was going to say, around issues around climate change, when they're not quite in agreement with the idea of climate change and of course climate finance, green energy, just transition. These are the values that America actually absolutely abhors under the Donald Trump administration. So interesting that America didn't want to partake in this particular conference, perhaps avoiding a very awkward scenario or situation where they will actually have to say something about climate finance or climate change transition and the finance that goes into all of that in terms of helping African countries to actually adapt to climate change and of course come up with innovative, economically sustainable ways of adapting to climate change as to not actually compromise the economies. But the problem here is that there is no real commitment, to climate change and of course adaptation. Something that you correctly highlighted in your statement. And America, I think of all the countries that are currently important to this discussion, at least it was very, very clear, without actually mincing its words, that it does not really want to actually talk about climate change. It does not want to talk about sustainability. As a matter of fact, America is actually out of the Paris Agreement through Donald Trump, obviously. And that, I think, is something that is obviously going to really have far-reaching implications on the discussions around climate change and, of course, the commitment that really has to come with all of that. So very, very precarious situation. It's a very, very contentious topic as well, something that I don't think is going to be resolved anytime soon, not least in this conference.
Is there a difficult balancing act that South Africa has to manage, being a member of BRICS on the one hand, and then this G20 grouping? There are some members that belong to both, but it does seem as if they're on different agendas as groupings.
Well, another contentious topic. So let's look at Marco Rubio, his reasons for not wanting to come to South Africa. As mentioned, I've stated other reasons, but one of the reasons that he actually indicated, very subtly so, referring, I think, to BRICS, he spoke about how he does not want to mollycoddle, anti-Americanism. What did he actually mean by that? I mean, apart from all other countries that are actually present here, one can only think of BRICS as the only bloc here that one might actually construe to be anti-America, or at least it has been painted to be anti-America, even though, of course, BRICS has not quite explicitly said that it is actually anti-Americanism. But I think in Marco Rubio stating that he doesn't have time to be boycotting anti-Americanism, I think was actually referring exactly to that. He was referring to BRICS in many ways, more ways than one. And South Africa here, as a host of this occasion, obviously finds itself between a rock and a hard place, given the fact that, it is a member of BRICS, is a very, very, very important player in BRICS. It has obviously been part of important discussions around how BRICS is going to navigate the world, everything from the transition from American dollar to, an alternative to the dollar, and of course, other things as well that have obviously sort of raised the ire of America, especially around issue of the dollar itself being replaced by an alternative currency, with Donald Trump himself actually coming back and say, if BRICS go on this silly expedition of trying to replace the US dollar, where I'm going to impose 150% tariff hike on all their their exports into America. So very, very interesting thing, but not least for South Africa, given the fact that South Africa is actually part of AGOA. Now, if South Africa actually continues on this tangent, what are the implications for AGOA? Will South Africa be taken out of AGOA as a punishment of sorts for actually pursuing the anti-American agenda that Marco Rubio seems to have intimated in his stance earlier on as reasons for not wanting to actually come to South Africa and actually participate in the G20 conference? I mean, let's look at how important AGOA is. AGOA actually accounts, at least for the South African economy, it accounts for about $14 billion US. That is absolutely massive. And about 22% of exports to America from South Africa, they're in the auto industry. And we have the auto industry playing a vital role in terms of job creation, economic growth, and what have you. But now, with AGOA possibly going to be ditching South Africa and actually keeping it out in the cold, there is a great possibility of the economy obviously taking a bit of a dip here. Now, that is the conundrum that South Africa finds itself in. On the one hand, it has to balance its interests with the West, particularly with AGOA, insofar as the economic opportunities that come with AGOA. On the other hand, it has to balance its interests with its partners in, the global South. BRICS obviously being, the fine example of that. And of course, with the West, looking at BRICS with a bit of a suspicion, how is South Africa going to navigate this? No one can actually really tell. But it seems to be one hell of a conundrum that no one actually wants to find themselves in. But South Africa, I think everybody is actually looking keenly to see how it's going to actually resolve this very, very, very important and very, very fragile conundrum that you've just correctly stated.
So beyond 2025, as we wrap up our conversation, what impacts could South Africa's 2025 presidency have perhaps on Africa's role in global governance and economic development?
It's very interesting, South Africa and of course trying to pursue or rather advance the African agenda here. And the African agenda was obviously something that has always been part and parcel of South Africa's key foreign policy focus when it comes to events like this. So it's not just the G20, but also think of BRICS as well. And when it comes to multilateral governance, I mean, this is something that South Africa considers to be a vital opportunity to really address the issues that obviously speak directly to Africa, pertaining to multilateralism, pertaining to the rule-based international order that we've advised and coalesced our support around, but also pertaining to such important discussions and topics and policy considerations relating to things like, for instance, climate change. Like, what is multilateralism going to do, or rather, what is going to be the impact of multilateralism in terms of actually helping Africa to adapt to climate change through the just transition, through climate change focused efforts to actually get Africa to actually participate heavily and of course be at the forefront of all discussions that actually pertain to issues that affect Africa, including climate change itself. It remains to be seen how the G20 is going to really pan out. We've only just entered the discussions, with the first meeting having just taken place, and rather having just been concluded, where it's actually now being followed by the finance ministers, or in the G20. I think it really remains to be seen how this thing's going to pan out. I think one can only sort of sit on the edge of one's own seat to see what are the important talking points that are actually coming out of the G20 through the many meetings that this conference is going to actually afford to different countries that are participating in this conference.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Professor Ellias Phaahla, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much indeed for your insights right here on Channel Africa Conversations.
And thank you so much for having me, Peter.
And so that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. So thanks so much indeed for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing you again. But before that, just a reminder, we'd love to hear from you about the kind of conversations that you want to see, and the kind of people that you want us to be having those conversations with. So please engage with us on our social media platforms on your screen now, and guide us, because we want this conversation to be about the kind of conversations that you want. And you can start by actually commenting in the comment section right here. Until the next time, take care.